People kept telling me I was overreacting, that I just wanted attention, that I was making drama where there was none. My family didn't even want to hear it. We don't do drama, they said, but the doctors had a very different opinion, and what came next would change everything. My name is Molly Tanner, and I never imagined the day I would hear the word cancer would be the day I realized how alone I really was. I grew up in Willow Creek, Ohio, a small town where everyone knew each other's business, but somehow never seemed to care about the pain right in front of their faces. I had always been a quiet kid, the kind who keeps her feelings tucked inside like fragile glass. My parents, Doug and Karen Tanner, were loving in their way, but emotionally reserved. They didn't talk about feelings, didn't talk about fear, and certainly didn't talk about illnesses unless it was convenient or socially acceptable. That way of life had always frustrated me, but I accepted it. It was who we were, or so I thought. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It started with small things, a lingering fatigue that no amount of sleep could shake, bruises that appeared on my arms and legs for no reason, and a persistent ache in my side that wouldn't go away. At first, I brushed it off as stress, or maybe my body telling me I needed to slow down. I was 28, a graphic designer with a thriving freelance career, and I loved to run. I thought I knew my body well enough to read the signs. But when I found a lump near my rib cage one late October morning, panic rose up like a tidal wave. I told my mom first, hesitating as I held the phone in my hand. Her reaction was not what I expected. "Molly," she said, almost dismissively, "stop worrying. We don't do drama in this family. You're fine." That was it. No questions, no concern, just a sharp reminder that expressing fear or needing attention for yourself was somehow wrong. I hung up the phone with a knot in my stomach. I tried talking to my dad later that evening, hoping for some validation, some acknowledgement that maybe this was serious. "Cancer? Really?" he scoffed, trying to laugh it off, though the nervousness in his eyes betrayed him. "You're young, you're healthy, stop imagining things." I wanted to scream, to shake them both and make them see that something was wrong, but I didn't. I had been conditioned my entire life to hold my emotions close, to keep my personal struggles internalized. And yet, despite the lack of support at home, I knew I couldn't ignore this. The next day, I made an appointment with a local clinic. Sitting in the waiting room, I felt a mix of fear and disbelief. Everything I had been told by my family echoed in my mind, telling me I was overreacting, that maybe I was just being dramatic. But there was a gnawing certainty in my gut that said otherwise. When Dr. Lillian Hayes, a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice, walked into the room, I immediately felt a shred of relief. She listened as I described the lump, the bruising, the fatigue, the pain. She didn't brush me off or laugh. She didn't ask me if I was overreacting. Instead, she ordered a series of tests immediately. "We'll figure this out, and we'll do it quickly." For the first time, I felt like someone was on my side. The tests came back faster than I expected. The phone call from Dr. Hayes was short, professional, but her words landed like a hammer. "Molly, the results show abnormal cell growth. It appears to be malignant. We need to start treatment as soon as possible." I sat on my couch staring at the phone in disbelief. My hands shook. I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. And then I thought about my family. How would I tell them? How would I make them understand when just days before they had insisted I was making a fuss over nothing? I decided to tell my mom first. Sitting across from her at the kitchen table, I tried to steady my voice. "Mom, I have cancer." She froze, a plate of toast halfway to her mouth. There was a long silence that felt like hours. Finally, she said, almost mechanically, "Well, we don't do drama. Can't you just handle it?" Her words cut me deeper than the diagnosis itself. I wanted her to cry, to hug me, to show any sign that she cared, but instead, there was only the same stoic, almost cold detachment I had known all my life. I turned to my dad that evening, hoping he might react differently. I found him in the garage, tinkering with his old truck. "Dad, I have cancer," I said, my voice breaking slightly. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at me, not with fear or concern, but with a strange mixture of confusion and discomfort. "Molly, you're overthinking this. You'll be fine," he muttered. That was it. No hugs, no tears, no concern. Just the same brush off I had gotten my entire life whenever I showed vulnerability. The weight of isolation settled on me like a suffocating blanket.
That night, I cried alone in my bedroom, thinking about the stark contrast between my family's reaction and the urgency I had just experienced at the clinic. The doctors were serious. The tests were serious. My body was serious. And yet, at home, it was as if nothing had changed. I realized that from this point on, I had to fight not just the disease, but also the silence and denial that my family had wrapped themselves in. It was terrifying, yes, but also strangely empowering. For the first time, I understood that my strength would have to come from within. I was on my own. And as I sat in that darkened room, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not let anyone, not even my own family, dictate the seriousness of my reality. I would fight this, and I would fight it hard. The next morning, the sun streamed through my bedroom window, but I didn't feel its warmth. Instead, I felt the cold weight of reality pressing down on me. The lump in my side, the blood tests, the scans, it was all real. I couldn't ignore it, even if my family did. I got out of bed and sat at my small kitchen table, staring at a mug of coffee that had gone cold. I had always been independent, proud of my ability to handle my life without leaning too much on anyone, but this was different. This was life and death, and it was terrifying to face it without the emotional support I had longed for my entire life. I knew that I had to start figuring out what my next steps would be, not only in terms of treatment, but also how I would navigate a family that refused to acknowledge the severity of what I was facing. I reached out to Dr. Hayes' office first thing, scheduling an in-depth consultation. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me with a sympathetic smile. I wanted to sink into the chair in relief just knowing that here, someone understood that this was serious. Dr. Hayes entered moments later, her white coat crisp, her demeanor calm but purposeful. She sat across from me, opened my chart, and looked at me with a mixture of empathy and firmness. "Molly, you're facing something serious," she said. "But the good news is we have options. Chemotherapy, targeted treatments, and a monitoring plan that can work with your specific case. You're young, otherwise healthy, and strong. That gives us an advantage." Her words brought a strange combination of fear and hope. For the first time, I felt a path forward, even if it was terrifyingly uncertain. I left the clinic with my head spinning, clutching the stack of paperwork the nurse had handed me. Treatments, schedules, medications, side effects. It was overwhelming, but it also felt like the first step in reclaiming control over my life. I thought about calling my family again, trying one more time to get through to them, to make them understand. I dialed my mom's number, rehearsing what I would say. "Mom, I need you to understand this is serious. The doctors have a plan, and I need support." But when she answered, her tone was flat, almost bored. "Molly, stop calling so much. You're fine. Don't make a big deal out of this. We don't do drama." That was the line I had heard over and over, and with each repetition, it was like a dagger twisting in my chest. I realized that I couldn't rely on my parents. They were emotionally incapable of giving me what I needed, and trying to force it out of them was only causing me more pain. I felt a quiet, simmering anger, but also a resolve building within me. If I wanted to survive this, and I did, I would have to create my own support system. I called my best friend, Jenna Carver, who had been like a sister to me since childhood. When I told her what was happening, her reaction was immediate. "Molly, I'm coming over. You are not alone in this. We're going to figure this out together." Her voice was steady, full of reassurance, and I felt my first real wave of relief since the diagnosis. It was a strange feeling to realize that my chosen family, friends, mentors, even colleagues, could sometimes provide more care and understanding than my biological family ever would. I knew that I had to start figuring out what my next steps would be, not only in terms of treatment, but also how I would navigate a family that refused to acknowledge the severity of what I was facing.
I reached out to Dr. Hayes' office first thing, scheduling an in-depth consultation. When I arrived, the receptionist greeted me with a sympathetic smile. I wanted to sink into the chair in relief, just knowing that here, someone understood that this was serious. Dr. Hayes entered moments later, her white coat crisp, her demeanor calm but purposeful. She sat across from me, opened my chart, and looked at me with a mixture of empathy and firmness. "Molly, you're facing something serious," she said. "But the good news is we have options. Chemotherapy, targeted treatments, and a monitoring plan that can work with your specific case. You're young, otherwise healthy, and strong. That gives us an advantage." Her words brought a strange combination of fear and hope. For the first time, I felt a path forward, even if it was terrifyingly uncertain. I left the clinic with my head spinning, clutching the stack of paperwork the nurse had handed me. Treatments, schedules, medications, side effects. It was overwhelming, but it also felt like the first step in reclaiming control over my life. I thought about calling my family again, trying one more time to get through to them, to make them understand. I dialed my mom's number, rehearsing what I would say. "Mom, I need you to understand this is serious. The doctors have a plan, and I need support." But when she answered, her tone was flat, almost bored. "Molly, stop calling so much. You're fine. Don't make a big deal out of this. We don't do drama." That was the line I had heard over and over, and with each repetition, it was like a dagger twisting in my chest. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I realized that I couldn't rely on my parents. They were emotionally incapable of giving me what I needed, and trying to force it out of them was only causing me more pain. I felt a quiet, simmering anger, but also a resolve building within me. If I wanted to survive this, and I did, I would have to create my own support system. I called my best friend, Jenna Carver, who had been like a sister to me since childhood. When I told her what was happening, her reaction was immediate. "Molly, I'm coming over. You are not alone in this. We're going to figure this out together." Her voice was steady, full of reassurance, and I felt my first real wave of relief since the diagnosis. It was a strange feeling to realize that my chosen family, friends, mentors, even colleagues, could sometimes provide more care and understanding than my biological family ever would. Over the next few days, I began to educate myself about my condition. I read medical journals, researched treatment options, and asked Dr. Hayes countless questions. Each answer felt like a lifeline, a way to anchor myself in something solid amid the swirling uncertainty. The more I learned, the more I realized that ignoring the warning signs could have been fatal. My body was telling me something, and I had to listen. It wasn't about drama, it was about survival. But that idea, survival over denial, was one that I would have to internalize deeply, especially as I prepared to face my family again with information they weren't ready to hear. When I finally decided to confront them, I went prepared. I printed out medical reports, lab results, and a summary of Dr. Hayes' recommendations. Sitting in the living room, I laid everything on the coffee table. "Look at this," I said quietly. "This isn't me being dramatic, this is real. The doctors are serious, and I need your support." My parents glanced at the papers, their faces betraying a mixture of irritation and discomfort. My dad muttered something about bureaucracy and unnecessary worry. and my mom looked away, fidgeting with a dish towel. I wanted to scream, to make them see the truth through sheer force of will, but I realized something critical in that moment. No matter how much evidence I presented, they weren't going to change. Their version of strength was denial, and I couldn't force them into empathy. That realization was painful, but also strangely liberating. I didn't need them to validate my pain or fight my battle for me. I had Dr. Hayes, I had Jenna, and I had myself. I decided that from this point forward, I would channel my energy into action rather than begging for acknowledgement. I set up my treatment schedule, met with nutritionists, and began researching complementary therapies to support my body through chemotherapy. Every decision I made was about survival. Every choice a small rebellion against the family dynamic that had always silenced me. I began documenting my journey, not just as a record for myself, but as a way to process the emotional turbulence that came with being ignored, dismissed, and yet still expected to carry on as if everything were normal. As I walked home one crisp autumn evening, the leaves crunching under my feet, I realized that the landscape of my life had shifted. I was no longer living under the shadow of my family's rules about what constituted acceptable concern or acceptable emotion. I was forging my own path, one rooted in truth, in honesty, and in the unwavering desire to survive. And while the road ahead was terrifyingly uncertain, I felt the first stirrings of something powerful. The understanding that courage isn't always loud or dramatic. Sometimes courage is quiet, deliberate, and stubbornly persistent. And for the first time, I felt that courage rising within me. The days after setting up my treatment plan passed in a surreal blur. I felt caught between two worlds. The one that I had always known, filled with the comforting predictability of my family's routines, and the one that I was stepping into. A raw, unfamiliar world where my own survival demanded action, knowledge, and courage. The contrast was jarring. At home, Doug and Karen went about their lives as though nothing had happened. Dinner conversations remained hollow, focused on mundane chores and gossip from the neighborhood. I couldn't tell if they were deliberately ignoring me or if they genuinely didn't understand the gravity of my situation. Either way, the effect was the same. I felt isolated in the very place where I should have felt safest. It was exhausting, emotionally and physically. And yet, I couldn't let that stop me. Every day mattered now. Every decision mattered. I spent my mornings at the hospital, meeting with Dr. Hayes and the treatment team, learning about the regimen that would become my lifeline. Chemotherapy, they explained, wasn't just a treatment, it was a strategic battle against something that didn't care about my emotions, my family dynamics, or my quiet despair. Each session would be grueling, but each session would also be a chance to fight back. My nurses, Clara and Jose, became my anchors. They were the first people who didn't flinch when I cried, who didn't tell me I was being dramatic, who didn't offer cliches about positivity and perseverance. They simply cared, and that care felt revolutionary. I began to realize how much strength could be found in small acts of kindness and acknowledgement, and how devastatingly cruel the absence of those acts could be. One afternoon, after a particularly rough round of tests and scans, Dr. Hayes called me into her office. I braced myself, my hands gripping the edge of the chair. She looked at me, her expression serious but not alarmed. "Molly," she began, "we've confirmed that this is aggressive but treatable. The sooner we start, the better your prognosis. You have a strong chance of remission, but time is critical." I nodded, fighting back tears, and felt a rush of both relief and fear. Relief that there was a plan, that my survival was possible. Fear that the road ahead would be treacherous and that I couldn't rely on my family for anything, even the simplest support. The emotional weight of that realization was almost as heavy as the physical strain of the illness itself. Determined to not let the silence at home define my journey, I reached out to an online support group for young adults facing cancer. At first, I was hesitant. I had always been private, wary of sharing vulnerabilities, and uncertain about whether anyone could truly understand what I was going through. But the messages I read were full of empathy, solidarity, and practical advice. People shared stories of treatment struggles, emotional breakdowns, and victories, however small. Reading them, I felt a strange kinship, a reminder that I was not alone, that there was a network of individuals who understood my fear and my determination without judgment or dismissal. For the first time, the phrase, "you've got this," didn't feel empty. It felt like a lifeline.
Meanwhile, my attempts to engage my family in meaningful conversation continued to fail. I tried explaining the schedule of treatments, the side effects I was preparing for, the reality of my diagnosis. Each time, I was met with vague nods, dismissive comments, or complete avoidance. One evening, as I set my medications on the kitchen counter and attempted to explain the importance of my upcoming infusion, my mom sighed and said, "Molly, we've told you, we don't do drama. Just handle it quietly." I felt a flash of anger that burned through me, hotter than any fever I had experienced since the diagnosis. How could the people who were supposed to care for me most reduce the most critical moment of my life to a matter of family reputation? But amid that anger, a steely resolve began to form. I wouldn't let their detachment stop me. I would fight with or without their acknowledgement. The first day of chemotherapy arrived with a mixture of dread and determination. Walking into the hospital that morning, I gripped my small duffel bag and my medical paperwork like armor. Clara guided me to the infusion chair, helping me settle in with a quiet efficiency that was comforting. Jose explained the process, step by step, checking my vitals and answering my questions with patience. The first drip began, a slow, rhythmic flow that seemed almost symbolic of the battle I had just committed to. Each minute stretched into eternity, each twinge of discomfort a reminder of the fight I had accepted. I felt a profound mix of vulnerability and power. Vulnerable because my body was under assault, powerful because I was actively taking steps to reclaim my life. By the time the infusion ended, hours had passed, and my body felt heavy with exhaustion. I called Jenna on the way home, and hearing her voice instantly lifted some of the weight from my chest. "You did it," she said simply, but her words were enough. I realized then that support didn't have to come from the people who were supposed to provide it by default. Real support could come from those who chose to be there, who were present because they wanted to be, not because they were obligated. And that thought brought me a strange sense of peace amid the chaos. That evening, as I sat on my bedroom floor journaling about the day, I allowed myself to acknowledge the fear, the anger, and the grief that had been simmering inside me. I realized ignoring these feelings, like my family had trained me to do, was no longer an option. I needed to confront every emotion head-on, to accept that this battle was as much psychological as it was physical. Writing became my outlet, a safe space where I could process what my family refused to see, where I could validate my own experience in the absence of external acknowledgement. And in that quiet, reflective moment, I understood something fundamental. The fight for survival wasn't just about beating cancer. It was about reclaiming my voice, asserting my reality, and refusing to let anyone, not even my own family, dictate the terms of my pain. A week after my first chemotherapy session, I began noticing subtle changes. Not in my body, which already felt heavy and drained, but in the way the world outside my immediate bubble started to shift. News travels fast in Willow Creek, especially when you live in a place where everyone knows everyone's business. What I hadn't anticipated was that my diagnosis, though ignored by my family, was quietly rippling through other circles in ways I couldn't control. It started with my cousin, Ethan Harper, who lived across town and had always been more emotionally attuned than the rest of my family. He dropped by unexpectedly one evening, knocking lightly before stepping into my kitchen. His eyes were wide with concern, and for a moment I was startled by the genuine worry in his gaze. "Molly, I heard about the hospital visits.
I know your parents don't really deal with this kind of thing, but I want you to know I'm here. Whatever you need, I'm here." It was the first acknowledgement I had received from my family network that my situation was serious, and I felt a strange, bittersweet relief. Ethan didn't stop at words. The next morning, he accompanied me to a follow-up appointment with Dr. Hayes, a quiet presence in the waiting room as I faced the next round of scans. My parents had still refused to go with me, brushing it off with their usual mantra, "We don't do drama." Ethan's attendance, though, highlighted a simple truth I had been unwilling to confront. Sometimes support comes from unexpected sources, and the people who deny reality can be bypassed entirely if you find allies willing to act. At the clinic, Dr. Hayes smiled when she saw him. She said quietly, "It's always good to have someone with you, Molly." And I felt a surge of validation. This wasn't about drama or attention. It was about survival. And finally, there was someone who understood that.
The scans that day revealed more than I expected. Dr. Hayes explained that the cancer was aggressive and fast-moving, requiring an adjusted treatment plan. The urgency in her voice sent a jolt through me. "We need to start a combination therapy immediately," she said. "This isn't optional. The sooner we begin, the better your chances of remission." Ethan nodded silently beside me, but I noticed his expression tighten in alarm. He turned to me afterward, his eyes reflecting both worry and determination. "Molly, you can't fight this alone. Your parents won't, but I will. You have to let me help." It was the first time anyone from my family circle had stepped forward actively, moving from passive concern to tangible support. And in that moment, I realized how critical it was to have outside eyes see the truth, to bear witness when those closest to me chose to look away. Back at home, I tried to relay the new developments to my parents, expecting, if nothing else, some acknowledgement. Instead, Doug waved a hand dismissively while Karen avoided eye contact entirely. "Just do what the doctors say and don't make a fuss about it," my dad muttered. It was infuriating, but also clarifying. I understood then that my parents' emotional detachment wasn't malice. It was a deeply ingrained habit, a worldview that treated vulnerability as weakness. I couldn't rely on them to advocate for me or to recognize the danger I faced. If I wanted to survive, I had to lean on those who were willing to confront the truth. That realization steeled me, gave me clarity. The fight for my life was mine first and foremost. With Ethan's support, I began documenting everything: my symptoms, side effects, treatment schedules, and even the interactions with my family. Each entry reinforced a pattern. My health was urgent, but my parents' denial created a dangerous gap in advocacy. Ethan encouraged me to share the documentation with a local social worker he knew, someone experienced in patient advocacy and family counseling. The social worker, Marie, reviewed the notes with precision and concern. "Molly, you've been dismissed, and that's not just emotional, it can be dangerous. I can help mediate if needed and make sure your medical needs are taken seriously, even if your family refuses to participate." For the first time, the invisible walls I had been bumping against at home were starting to be challenged by objective outside eyes, who could see the truth clearly and intervene. Meanwhile, treatment intensified. The combination therapy brought new physical challenges, nausea, fatigue, and moments of dizziness so severe that I had to lean on Ethan just to walk down the hall. Yet, each step forward was an act of defiance, a reaffirmation that my life mattered. During one particularly rough session, a nurse named Clara handed me a warm blanket and said, "You're stronger than you realize, Molly. The people who see you clearly are the ones who matter right now. Let them be your strength." Those words resonated in a way that my parents never could. I realized that when truth is visible to those willing to see it, it gains a kind of power that denial cannot touch. Even with external support, I struggled internally. The lack of acknowledgement from my parents gnawed at me, leaving a persistent ache of grief and frustration. Why could they not recognize the seriousness of my condition? Why was their mantra about avoiding drama more important than their daughter's life?
But alongside that grief, I discovered something equally potent: the recognition that I didn't need their permission to validate my own reality. I had evidence, witnesses, medical experts, and allies who were ready to act. Their denial could no longer hold sway over my actions or my resolve. For the first time, the truth wasn't hidden by fear or avoidance. It was out in the open, visible to those who mattered and ready to demand the attention and action it deserved. By the end of that week, a subtle but profound shift had occurred. Outside eyes, Ethan, Dr. Hayes, Marie, and even the nurses who had seen me through the first rounds of chemotherapy had begun to challenge the narrative of denial at home. I felt empowered in a way I hadn't before. For the first time since my diagnosis, I realized that I wasn't alone, even if my family chose to be absent emotionally. The truth had found witnesses, and with witnesses comes accountability. That truth, I understood, was the first weapon in a battle that was only beginning, and it was a weapon I intended to wield with everything I had. As the weeks passed, the battle I was waging against cancer became increasingly physical, but the emotional war with my family, though silent, was no less grueling. Each morning, I awoke to exhaustion, my body still weighed down by the lingering effects of chemotherapy from the day before. Yet the mental strain was often sharper than any physical ache. My parents continued their pattern of denial, making casual remarks about my overthinking or telling me to rest without fussing over the seriousness of my treatments. Doug and Karen acted as though life should continue unchanged, their denial a thin veneer covering a fundamental inability to process or acknowledge vulnerability. It was exhausting, frustrating, and increasingly isolating. The loneliness gnawed at me, but I refused to let it paralyze me. I had to find a way to navigate this, and that meant relying on the external allies who had begun to see the truth clearly. Ethan was my anchor. He drove me to appointments, helped me track side effects, and spent hours listening without judgment. He became a constant witness to my reality, someone who could articulate the seriousness of my condition in ways my parents could not, or would not. One evening, he handed me a folder thick with notes he had compiled from my medical team, a careful summary of every scan, every lab result, and every step of the proposed treatment plan. "I thought it would help if you had this," he said quietly. "And if your parents won't take it seriously, at least you have something concrete you can reference." I flipped through the pages and felt a wave of reassurance. The evidence was undeniable. The cancer was aggressive, treatment was urgent, and the denial I faced at home could no longer dictate my actions. It was the first time I fully understood the power of tangible proof, and how crucial it was when others refused to see what was in front of them. But even with evidence in hand, the struggle was far from over. My parents' responses became increasingly strained as they were confronted with facts they could not easily dismiss. I had started leaving copies of medical reports on the kitchen counter, hoping they would at least read them. Doug glanced once, muttered something about worrying too much, and left the room. Karen avoided eye contact entirely. Their emotional distance, even in the face of concrete evidence, felt like a deliberate barrier. I realized that while evidence could illuminate the truth, it could not force someone to acknowledge it emotionally. That realization was bitter, but it also forced me to recalibrate my expectations. I could not rely on them to act. I could only act myself and enlist those who were willing to see clearly. To strengthen my support system, I began meeting regularly with Marie, the social worker Ethan had connected me with. She helped me organize my documentation, coached me on communicating with medical professionals, and even discussed strategies for navigating my family's persistent denial. One afternoon, she said something that hit me like a revelation. "Molly, when you present truth to someone who refuses to see it, it's not a failure on your part. It's a reflection of their limitations. You are doing everything right by gathering evidence and advocating for yourself. That's what counts." I held on to her words like a lifeline. They gave me permission to stop fighting for acknowledgement I would never receive from my parents, and to focus instead on what could make a tangible difference: my treatment, my health, and my life. Meanwhile, the physical side effects of chemotherapy intensified.
My energy waned to the point where even standing was an effort. Nausea became a constant companion, and my body felt foreign to me. The stark contrast between the medical team's care and my family's indifference became even more pronounced. At the clinic, nurses would gently support me, monitor every reaction, and celebrate small victories, like when I managed to finish a treatment session without vomiting, or when my blood counts remained stable. At home, my parents would ask routine questions about meals or chores, but never inquire about the treatment's toll on my body or my mind. It was infuriating, but it also strengthened my resolve. I began to see the situation clearly. My family's refusal to engage emotionally did not reduce the seriousness of my condition, nor could it slow the disease or the treatment process. One evening, after an especially difficult treatment day, Ethan suggested we speak to a patient advocate at the hospital to formally address my family's reluctance to acknowledge my condition. The advocate, a woman named Samantha, reviewed my files and nodded thoughtfully. This is a serious case, and while you cannot make them feel or care, you can create accountability. I can help you ensure that your medical needs are fully recognized and that the treatment team has your support network documented. The idea of creating external accountability felt empowering. I realized that the opposition, my parents' denial, was not insurmountable. It just needed to be countered with structured, objective evidence and support. At the same time, I noticed subtle cracks forming in my family's behavior. Doug would linger longer in the living room when I returned from appointments, and Karen occasionally glanced at my medication schedule without saying a word. It wasn't much, and it didn't signal true acknowledgement, but it was enough to hint that the presence of evidence and external pressure was starting to make an impact. I understood then that rising opposition wasn't always loud or confrontational. Sometimes it manifested as tension, avoidance, or discomfort, the first signs that truth was beginning to pierce through layers of denial. I began documenting these small shifts meticulously, pairing them with my medical notes. Every instance of avoidance, every dismissive comment, every reluctant glance was recorded alongside lab results, treatment plans, and nurse observations. My journal became both a practical tool and an emotional outlet. It gave me clarity and a sense of control in an environment where my family's denial otherwise threatened to leave me adrift. By assembling this evidence, I was not only advocating for my health, but also laying the groundwork for future confrontations, should they become necessary.
By the end of the month, the pattern was undeniable. I had a growing body of evidence, an unwavering support system outside my immediate family, and the knowledge that my survival depended on action rather than approval. The rising opposition, in the form of my parents' persistent denial, was relentless, but it was also starting to have cracks in its armor. I realized that the next steps, presenting the undeniable truth, facing the tension head-on, and rallying my allies, would define not just my treatment, but the emotional course of my life for months to come. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to continue fighting, armed with proof, witnesses, and a courage that refused to be silenced. It was a rainy Thursday when the moment came that would change everything, the point when denial could no longer mask the truth, and the reality of my situation became undeniable, not just to me, but to anyone who looked closely enough. I had just returned from my latest series of scans, exhausted from the morning's treatments and the emotional toll of sitting through the results. Dr. Hayes had asked me to come in alone this time, though Ethan insisted on coming along. As we stepped into her office, the fluorescent lights felt almost oppressive, and my chest tightened with anticipation. "Molly," she said softly, motioning for me to sit, "we've reviewed your latest imaging and biopsy results in depth, and the findings are conclusive. The cancer has progressed more quickly than we anticipated, but we also have a very clear path forward." She handed me a stack of papers, charts, and annotated scans, each page meticulously documenting the spread of the malignancy. I stared at the images, at the sharp, unnatural shadows mapped across what was once my body, and a cold realization sank into me. This was incontrovertible proof. The cancer was aggressive, undeniable, and real, far beyond what my family had been willing to acknowledge. I looked at Ethan, whose hand rested on my shoulder, and saw his expression change from concern to quiet determination. "Molly," he whispered, "this is serious. No more room for denial. We have to treat it like it is." His voice was steady, unwavering, and for the first time, I felt a surge of relief tempered by fear. Here was the undeniable proof, the evidence that couldn't be brushed aside, ignored, or minimized. When I returned home, I placed the stack of reports on the kitchen counter in front of my parents. Doug glanced at the top sheet and muttered something about paperwork being confusing. Karen picked up one of the scans and turned it over in her hands as if she could somehow wish it away. I watched their faces carefully, noting the slight tightening around Doug's eyes and the hesitant flicker of concern in Karen's gaze. The evidence was visual, concrete, undeniable, and yet their instinct was still to retreat. But this time, the proof was so overwhelming that avoidance felt almost impossible. I felt a sense of vindication, a grim satisfaction in knowing that the truth was now fully visible, even if my parents weren't ready to confront it. Ethan stayed with me that evening, sorting through the charts and explaining each annotation in detail. "See here," he said, pointing to a marked region on one of the scans. "This is why Dr. Hayes wants you on the combination therapy immediately. There's no ambiguity. If anyone doubts this, it's on paper for them to see." I felt a sense of empowerment that had been building for weeks now solidify into something tangible. For the first time, I understood that undeniable proof does more than confirm reality. It shifts the balance of power. My parents' denial, as ingrained as it was, could no longer dictate my decisions. The treatment team, backed by concrete evidence, had effectively removed any room for minimization or dismissal. The following day, I brought the charts to Dr. Hayes again for further consultation, this time with Ethan sitting beside me as an advocate. "We're going to accelerate your treatment plan," she said, pointing to the progression timelines. "This combination therapy must start immediately. We're seeing clear growth, and every day counts. The sooner we intervene, the better your odds." The clarity in her voice cut through weeks of emotional fog, and I realized how vital it was to have objective, undeniable evidence, not just for myself, but for the people in my life who were finally willing to see the truth. The scans, the biopsy results, the annotated charts, they were no longer abstract concepts. They were weapons against denial, tools to enforce the seriousness of my condition. Back at home, I decided to confront the situation head-on once more. I laid the charts and reports out on the living room table, highlighting the areas of growth, the biopsy results, and the urgency of immediate treatment. This isn't a suggestion. This isn't drama. This is the reality, and the treatment team is clear. I need action now. Doug's jaw tightened, and Karen's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages. For the first time, I saw hesitation replacing denial. There was no cheering, no dramatic declaration of support, but the undeniable proof had pierced the walls they had built around themselves. The truth was visible, and now, even if begrudgingly, it could no longer be ignored.
That night, I sat on my bedroom floor with my journal, reflecting on the shift that had taken place. Weeks of emotional struggle, isolation, and frustration had led to this turning point. I had amassed the evidence, documented every interaction, and listed allies like Ethan and Dr. Hayes, and finally, the truth had become incontrovertible. I understood now that undeniable proof was not just about charts or scans. It was about creating a reality that could not be argued away. My family's reluctance, my parents' habitual denial, no longer held sway over my life or my decisions. The facts were unassailable, and my next steps would be guided by truth, not avoidance or fear. Even in the quiet of my bedroom, I felt a subtle shift in the emotional landscape. The undeniable proof had not erased fear, nor had it softened the pain of isolation, but it had given me something more powerful: leverage, clarity, and validation.
I could now approach my treatment with authority, knowing that the evidence supported my choices. And in that moment, I realized that this revelation, the point where truth becomes impossible to deny, is what separates those who survive from those who falter in the shadows of avoidance. For me, the proof was the turning point, the catalyst that transformed uncertainty into action, fear into determination, and isolation into a battleground where the truth could finally wield power over denial. It was late one evening, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, when I realized I could no longer wait for my parents to act, to acknowledge, or to support me. The undeniable proof was there, the scans, the biopsy results, the treatment schedules, but my family's inaction was a wall I could no longer batter with words alone. I understood, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that the choice to act lay entirely with me. I could let their denial define my reality, or I could step fully into my own agency and speak the truth loudly, forcefully, and unapologetically. That night, I made my decision. I would stop holding space for their avoidance. I would demand acknowledgement, rally allies, and ensure that my survival was not contingent on the emotional limitations of my parents. I began by calling a family meeting, one that my parents had no choice but to attend. I asked Ethan to come with me as a witness and support, and we arranged to meet at the small conference room of the hospital where Dr. Hayes often held consultations. My parents arrived reluctantly, shuffling into the room with their usual mix of irritation and discomfort. I could feel their unease radiating in the air, a palpable resistance to the confrontation they knew was coming. I took a deep breath, holding in the tremor in my hands, and began laying out the facts, the progression of the cancer, the urgency of the treatment plan, and the undeniable evidence that I had collected over the past weeks. I spoke slowly, deliberately, ensuring that every detail, every scan annotation, every lab result was visible and undeniable. Doug shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Karen fiddled with her sleeve, glancing away as though ignoring the evidence could make it disappear. But Ethan remained calm, supportive, and attentive, occasionally offering clarifications when my voice wavered. He said quietly, echoing my words, "This is serious. We're not talking about drama or overreaction. The medical team is clear. Action is urgent, and Molly needs support." My parents exchanged a look, and I realized that this was the first crack in the armor of denial. My words alone hadn't been enough, and their habitual avoidance had persisted until undeniable proof paired with external advocacy forced the confrontation. But now, standing in that room with evidence in hand and witnesses beside me, the choice to act or continue denying was theirs. I could feel a mix of fear, anger, and determination rising within me as I continued speaking. I explained every aspect of my treatment plan, detailing the combination therapy, the infusion schedule, and the supportive measures recommended by Dr. Hayes. I said, "This isn't optional. I can't wait for you to change your minds emotionally. The clock is ticking and every day matters. You can choose to be part of this and help, or you can step aside. But I will not let denial dictate my survival." The room was silent, except for the soft rustle of papers and the occasional clearing of a throat. My parents looked cornered, and in that moment I realized that speaking truthfully, fully, and with conviction was more powerful than waiting for acknowledgement. I had stepped past the point of no return, and my agency had become my weapon. After the meeting, Ethan and I sat in the parking lot for a long time, the rain streaking the windshield, our hands wrapped around steaming cups of coffee. "You did it," he said finally, his voice gentle but full of awe. You didn't let them control the narrative. You took the truth into your own hands, and you made sure it could no longer be ignored. I felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. It had been terrifying to confront my family so directly, but it was also empowering to see that the undeniable proof, combined with courage and advocacy, could force the issue into the open. It wasn't about shaming them or making them feel guilty. It was about asserting the reality of my life, ensuring that my survival could not be compromised by emotional avoidance.
In the days that followed, subtle but meaningful changes began to emerge. My parents, while still awkward and uncomfortable, began attending appointments, first reluctantly, then more regularly. Doug asked questions, haltingly, about the treatment plan, while Karen occasionally sat quietly in the infusion room, her gaze fixed on me with an expression I could only interpret as concern. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the emotional warmth I had once hoped for, but it was a beginning. The act of speaking the truth, of fully confronting both the medical reality and the family dynamic, had broken a dam that had been holding back acknowledgement and action for too long. Meanwhile, I continued to rely on my external support network. Dr. Hayes, Ethan, Marie, and the nursing staff became my pillars of strength, guiding me through each treatment, validating my emotions, and reinforcing the urgency of the situation. I began documenting these interactions meticulously, both for my own clarity and to ensure that every step of my advocacy was backed by evidence. Speaking truth, I realized, was not a one-time event. It was an ongoing process that required consistency, courage, and unwavering attention to detail. The choice to speak had set the stage for accountability, but the follow-through was where survival truly depended. By the end of the week, a new dynamic had settled into the household. My parents were present in ways they hadn't been before, not fully emotionally engaged, but visible, if reluctantly so. I understood that their participation was still limited, that denial and discomfort ran deep, but the choice to speak, to confront the truth openly and with evidence, had shifted the power in my favor. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt a sense of control, of agency, of clarity. I had chosen to act, and in doing so, I had created a foundation upon which my treatment, my recovery, and my life could be built. That night, as I lay in bed reflecting on the past week, I understood something profound. The point of no return was not the moment of diagnosis, nor the moment the evidence became undeniable. It was the moment I decided to speak, to assert my reality, and to demand acknowledgement. Courage, I realized, is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, deliberate, and persistent. Sometimes it is the act of speaking truth to those who would rather look away, even when the truth is inconvenient or uncomfortable. And in that quiet courage, I found a new sense of purpose, the strength to face the coming battles, and the knowledge that I would no longer allow denial to dictate the terms of my life. The confrontation that had been simmering beneath the surface finally erupted the following week. It wasn't dramatic in the sense of shouting or slamming doors. It was quieter, sharper, and more insidious. Doug and Karen had begun attending appointments, but their presence was laced with tension, a silent challenge to my newfound agency. I could feel their resistance like a static charge in the air every time we sat together in the infusion room or at the kitchen table discussing treatment plans. They were present, yes, but their skepticism and avoidance manifested in subtle digs, dismissive gestures, and half-hearted questions that tested my patience. The mounting pressure of their denial colliding with my insistence on truth created a constant undercurrent of conflict that seemed impossible to escape. That Wednesday, the confrontation reached a tipping point. I had just returned from a particularly grueling chemotherapy session, nausea twisting in my stomach and exhaustion weighing on every muscle, when Doug started in, his tone clipped and condescending. "Molly, are you sure you need all these treatments? Maybe you're overreacting. I mean, the doctors always err on the side of caution, right?" The words hit like a slap, not because they were untrue, but because they were deliberately undermining everything I had been fighting for. I felt my chest tighten, my hands balling into fists on the edge of the countertop.
Overreacting, I said, my voice sharp but controlled. Doug, I am not overreacting. I am following the advice of medical professionals, and these treatments are not optional. They are necessary. My survival depends on this. Your denial isn't just frustrating, it's dangerous. Karen, who had been standing silently, interjected with a sigh that carried equal parts exasperation and avoidance. Molly, we just want you to be careful, that's all. You don't need to stress everyone out with all this medical stuff. Her words were designed to deflect responsibility, to shift the emotional burden onto me. But I had learned over the past weeks that deflection would no longer work. I set the medical reports and scans down on the counter between us, tapping each one with deliberate emphasis. I said firmly, "Look at these. These are not opinions. These are facts. The treatment plan is urgent. The scans show progression. The biopsy confirms it. This is real. And I need action and support. Not excuses, not avoidance, not passive skepticism."
The room went silent for a long, uncomfortable moment. I could feel the weight of their internal struggle, the tension rising like a storm cloud ready to burst. Ethan, who had accompanied me, once again, leaned slightly forward, his presence both steadying and reinforcing. "Molly is right," he said quietly, but with a firmness that carried across the kitchen. "These reports are clear. Her choices are valid, and she is not asking for drama. She is asking for life-saving support. This isn't optional. This is urgent. And the longer you refuse to acknowledge it, the greater the risk." His words, calm but unwavering, seemed to land like stones thrown into a still pond, sending ripples of discomfort through my parents' carefully maintained emotional walls. Doug's face tightened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Karen avoided eye contact, but I could see the tension radiating from her shoulders. For a moment, I thought they might retreat entirely, refusing to engage, but the undeniable presence of evidence and advocacy had cornered them. There was no polite escape, no plausible avoidance this time. I felt a surge of quiet triumph, not over my parents, but over the pattern of denial that had dominated my life for so long. The confrontation was no longer just about asserting truth. It was about forcing accountability, creating stakes, and making it impossible for those who ignored reality to continue doing so without consequence. That evening, the tension carried into the treatment room. Nurses noticed the shift in my demeanor and offered quiet support. Clara checking my vitals with extra care, and Jose ensuring my infusion was on schedule. I realized that confrontation, even with my parents, had become part of the treatment process. It was no longer just about medicine. It was about creating an environment in which truth, evidence, and action could coexist, even in the face of resistance. I documented the entire interaction meticulously, noting the subtle changes in their behavior, the expressions of skepticism, and the moments when evidence and advocacy had pierced their defenses. Every detail mattered, because this mounting pressure wasn't going away, and the documentation would serve both as a record and as a tool for future confrontations. By the end of the week, the tension reached a strange equilibrium. My parents were present more consistently, though still awkwardly, and their attempts at denial had softened slightly in the face of repeated evidence and advocacy. Yet the conflict remained simmering beneath the surface, like embers in a dying fire, threatening to flare up at any moment. I learned that confrontation with antagonistic forces, especially those emotionally invested in denial, is rarely resolved in a single moment. It is ongoing, exhausting, and requires both strategy and resilience. But with each encounter, the walls of avoidance and minimization eroded slightly, and the space for truth, acknowledgement, and action expanded. That night, as I sat with my journal, reflecting on the day's events, I realized that mounting pressure, confrontation combined with evidence and external advocacy, was transforming the dynamic at home. My parents were beginning to see the truth,
even grudgingly. And I was discovering a deeper layer of resilience within myself. It was no longer enough to quietly follow a treatment plan and hope for passive support. The battle for acknowledgement, the direct confrontation with denial, had become a vital part of my survival. And as I wrote, my hand steady despite fatigue, I understood that this pressure, this friction, was not a hindrance. It was a catalyst, shaping me into someone capable of demanding truth, enforcing accountability, and refusing to let anyone's emotional avoidance compromise my life. The days after the confrontation felt heavier than any chemotherapy session I had endured. Physically, my body was battered from treatments, each infusion leaving me weak, nauseous, and trembling with fatigue. But the emotional toll, the isolation, the lingering tension, the cold resistance from my parents was far more exhausting. Even with Ethan and the medical team by my side, the absence of genuine acknowledgement from the people who should have been my strongest allies created a persistent ache, a sense of betrayal that no medication could touch. I felt trapped between two realities, the one where my life depended on urgent action and evidence-based treatment, and the one where my parents' denial loomed over me like a shadow, threatening to undermine every step I took. I remember sitting alone in my bedroom one evening, the rain streaking the windows, my journal open, but my hands shaking as I tried to write. Tears blurred the ink, not from physical pain, but from a deep, gnawing despair. It wasn't just fear of the cancer. It was the emotional void left by the people who should have been my anchors. Doug and Karen were physically present sometimes, but their emotional withdrawal was suffocating. I longed for a simple acknowledgement, a touch of concern, a word that confirmed they understood the gravity of my situation. Instead, I received deflection, avoidance, and passive resistance. The isolation felt complete, a stark reminder that courage often exists in the absence of support, not because of it.
Even Ethan, my steadfast ally, could not fully fill the void. He was present, attentive, and unwavering, but he could not replace the emotional scaffolding I had expected from my parents. I realized that the real consequence of speaking truth and demanding acknowledgement was not always immediate relief. Sometimes it was exposure, vulnerability, and the risk of intensified conflict. The very act of insisting on being seen, of presenting undeniable proof, had forced a reckoning that left me emotionally raw. It was as though the walls my family had built for years had collapsed, but in their place was a chasm, vast and echoing, filled with the tension and isolation of confronting reality alone. At the hospital, I tried to focus on the tangible, the scans, the infusions, the lab results. But even there, the shadow of my family's denial lingered. During one particularly grueling infusion session, I leaned back in the chair, exhausted, pale, and trembling. Clara and Jose moved efficiently, monitoring my vitals, adjusting my IV, and offering small gestures of reassurance. "You're doing incredible," Clara said softly, her hand brushing mine in a gesture of comfort. Her words were kind, but they also highlighted the stark contrast between the support I was receiving here and the indifference I faced at home. I realized that emotional validation, even from outsiders, could sustain me in ways my family's denial never could. But it could not erase the underlying pain of being abandoned by the people I had always relied upon. That night, the isolation pressed in even harder. My parents stayed in the living room, the soft hum of the television a barrier between us. I could hear Doug muttering about schedules and bills, while Karen scrolled silently through her phone. Their presence felt performative, a surface-level acknowledgement without emotional engagement. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that the confrontation and undeniable proof would have shifted their perspective entirely. But the reality was harsher.
Acknowledgement and understanding are not always immediate, even in the face of facts. I was left to navigate the consequences of speaking truth without the comfort of full familial support. The emotional toll manifested in waves of doubt and fear. I found myself questioning every decision, every step of the treatment plan, wondering if I was overextending, overreacting, or misjudging the severity of my condition. But the evidence was there: scans, lab results, detailed notes from Dr. Hayes, and yet the absence of genuine concern from my family amplified my anxiety. I realized that advocacy, courage, and truth-telling come at a cost. Speaking out and demanding acknowledgement had brought clarity and action, but it had also left me vulnerable to emotional backlash, isolation, and moments of profound despair. To cope, I relied more heavily on journaling and my support network. I wrote long entries detailing my fears, my anger, my frustration, and my grief. I spoke openly with Ethan and Marie, sometimes venting, sometimes seeking guidance, always needing someone to witness the truth my parents refused to fully confront. In these moments, I discovered a subtle but vital truth. Survival is not just physical, it is emotional, and it requires building resilience in the face of abandonment. Courage does not eliminate fear. It simply allows action despite fear, despite isolation, despite the painful absence of those we wish would stand beside us. By the end of the week, I understood that the consequences of speaking truth had reached their peak. I was physically drained, emotionally raw, and isolated in a way that made every small triumph feel monumental. Yet within that crucible of despair, I also recognized the seeds of strength. The confrontation had forced me to claim my reality, to insist on evidence-based action, and to rely on those willing to stand with me. The lowest point, the dark night of the soul, was not just a moment of weakness, it was a pivotal phase that tested my resolve, my courage, and my commitment to survival. And in that testing, I began to see the contours of the next step, the final push, where truth would be presented openly, where accountability could be enforced, and where my voice, finally, would be heard and validated. The day of the final push arrived with a strange mix of trepidation and resolve. I had spent weeks preparing, not just for treatments, but for the confrontation that would leave no room for denial or avoidance. My parents' reluctance had been tempered by undeniable evidence, but the tension in the air was thick. I knew that this moment was about more than asserting facts. It was about forcing accountability, ensuring that my voice was heard, and creating a space where my survival could no longer be overshadowed by avoidance. Ethan came early that morning, as always, and together we reviewed my notes, medical reports, and a carefully organized timeline of events. He said, "Today, everyone sees the truth. No excuses, no denial. Just facts and your voice. That's what matters most."
We arrived at the hospital conference room where Dr. Hayes, the patient advocate Samantha, and Marie were waiting. I placed the reports, scans, and detailed charts across the table like weapons laid out for battle, each one a testament to the weeks of struggle, evidence gathering, and advocacy. My parents arrived shortly after, Doug and Karen's expressions unreadable, their postures stiff with tension. The room was silent except for the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint scratching of pen on paper as Marie prepared her notes. This was the moment where all the mounting pressure, all the confrontation, and all the undeniable evidence would be laid bare in a formal, structured way, leaving no room for avoidance. I began by speaking clearly and deliberately, walking my parents through the timeline of my diagnosis, the progression of the disease, and the urgency of the treatment plan. I pointed to the scans, highlighting areas of concern, then laid out the combination therapy schedule, blood work results, and notes from Dr. Hayes and the nursing staff. "This isn't optional," I said firmly. "This isn't about drama. This is my life, and it's unfolding in real time. You've seen the evidence.
You've been here, in this room. Now is the moment to act responsibly and acknowledge the reality, because every delay, every denial has consequences. My survival depends on action, not avoidance. Dr. Hayes reinforced my points with clinical precision, explaining the medical risks of any deviation from the prescribed treatment plan and outlining the rationale behind each recommendation. Samantha provided context on patient advocacy, emphasizing that my rights, health, and decisions had to be prioritized, even in the face of familial reluctance. Marie, sitting quietly beside me, added observations about patterns of avoidance and how they could interfere with effective care. The combined weight of the evidence, testimony, and expert opinion left little room for doubt. It was an orchestrated moment of truth where facts and voices converged in a way that could not be ignored. Doug shifted uncomfortably, finally meeting my gaze. "Molly, he started, but I interrupted gently but firmly. "Doug, it's not enough to start sentences. What matters is action. This is about responsibility, not comfort. You've seen the evidence. You've been present for the discussions. Words without acknowledgement are meaningless. I need action and I need clarity. Are you prepared to support my treatment plan fully?" Karen's hands trembled as she clutched the edge of her chair, eyes darting between the scans in my face. She nodded slowly, a hesitant acknowledgement, but I could see that she was beginning to grasp the weight of the moment, the gravity of the undeniable proof, and the stakes at hand. Ethan's presence, steady and calm, served as a bridge between my parents' lingering denial and the reality of the situation. He reinforced the importance of support, reiterating the need for consistency, acknowledgement, and practical action. It wasn't about shame or confrontation, it was about survival, responsibility, and the moral imperative of facing truth head-on. For the first time since my diagnosis, the room felt aligned, focused on the same objective, ensuring my treatment was prioritized and my voice validated. The tension was still present, but it had shifted from avoidance to engagement, from denial to accountability. By mid-afternoon, the conversation had evolved into a formal agreement. My parents would participate actively in my treatment plan, attend future appointments, and recognize the urgency of the situation. The scans and reports were photocopied and filed, ensuring that every member of the treatment team had clear documentation and that my family's accountability was recorded. It wasn't perfect, and the emotional distance was still palpable, but the undeniable truth had forced the situation into a structure where inaction was no longer an option. The advocacy, confrontation, and careful presentation of evidence had paid off, and my voice had finally been heard in a way that demanded respect. Returning home that evening, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a combination of relief, exhaustion, and quiet triumph. I had faced the mounting pressure, endured the confrontation, and navigated the consequences of speaking truth, and now I had clarity, support, and validation. The act of presenting undeniable proof, enforcing accountability, and asserting my voice had shifted the dynamic from passive neglect to engaged action. I realized that this was the culmination of weeks of courage, documentation, and strategic advocacy. The final push wasn't just about survival, it was about reclaiming agency, ensuring my voice mattered, and setting the stage for the emotional and physical battles yet to come. That night, as I reflected on the events, I understood the full significance of the moment. The confrontation had transformed my relationship with truth and survival. I had moved from passive victimhood to active agency, from isolation to a structured, supported environment where facts and voices converged to create accountability. The final push was complete, and the battle lines had been redrawn in favor of clarity, action, and empowerment. For the first time since my diagnosis, I felt that my survival was in my hands, backed by undeniable evidence, advocacy, and the courage to speak and be heard. The days following the confrontation felt surprisingly lighter, though the weight of my journey was still present in every ache, every bruise from IV needles, and every tremor left by chemotherapy. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of justice, not the punitive kind that punishes others, but the vindication that comes from truth prevailing over avoidance, from action replacing denial. My parents, while still awkward and hesitant, began engaging with my treatment plan more consistently.
Doug asked questions during appointments, seeking to understand, while Karen slowly, carefully offered small gestures of concern, preparing meals I could tolerate and checking my vitals at home. It wasn't perfect, nor was it the warm embrace I had imagined, but it was recognition, accountability, and a clear shift in the emotional dynamic that had plagued me since diagnosis. Dr. Hayes commented during my follow up visit that this engagement would make a tangible difference in my recovery. Support matters, she said quietly, reviewing my latest scans. It's not just the medicine, it's adherence, monitoring, and advocacy. When family and caregivers engage, even imperfectly, it directly impacts outcomes. Her words resonated deeply. I realized that the weeks of gathering evidence, confronting denial, and asserting my voice had not just been about emotional catharsis. They had created the conditions for practical, life-saving change. My agency, combined with undeniable proof and structured advocacy, had shifted the balance from uncertainty and isolation to tangible progress and participation. At home, the small acts of acknowledgement began to accumulate. Doug began tracking my medication schedule, ensuring doses were taken on time, and that side effects were reported to the clinic. Karen, quiet and deliberate, started attending some infusion sessions, sitting beside me without speaking, her presence alone a form of validation I had not dared to expect. I noticed subtle changes in their demeanor, shorter defensive responses, fewer dismissive gestures, a willingness to ask questions rather than deflect. These incremental steps felt monumental after weeks of emotional stagnation, a testament to the power of patience, evidence, and persistent truth-telling. I also found that my own perspective was shifting. Having forced accountability, having stood firm in the face of denial, and having confronted the mounting opposition, I felt a profound sense of empowerment. The fear and isolation that had once dominated my experience were still present, but they were tempered by clarity and purpose. I realized that speaking truth, gathering evidence, and insisting on accountability was not a one-time act. It was a sustained commitment that required courage, discipline, and unwavering focus. And in that commitment, I found a sense of justice, not external or punitive, but internal and transformative. Ethan remained by my side, a constant anchor, helping me navigate both the physical and emotional challenges. His presence reinforced the notion that justice and vindication do not always require universal agreement. They require allies who recognize the truth and act upon it. The combination of external support, undeniable proof, and persistent advocacy had created a network in which my survival could be prioritized, my voice could be heard, and my needs could be met. I began to understand that justice in situations like mine is not about punishment. It is about validation, acknowledgement, and creating conditions where truth leads to tangible outcomes. As the weeks progressed, the pattern of engagement solidified. My parents began following up with the clinic on their own, asking about progress, treatment efficacy, and upcoming appointments. Karen even started documenting my symptoms and reactions to chemotherapy, a silent but meaningful acknowledgement of responsibility. Doug, who had initially been resistant and skeptical, now participated in discussions about next steps and contingency plans. These changes were incremental, often clumsy, but they were unmistakable. The undeniable proof, combined with structured confrontation and persistent advocacy, had compelled them to act. Truth had prevailed over denial, and justice, however quietly, had been served. I began to see the emotional and physical progress as intertwined. The validation from my parents, the active engagement from my support team, and my own relentless advocacy created a feedback loop that reinforced resilience. I felt stronger, not just physically, but psychologically,
as if every act of acknowledgement and accountability fortified me against both the disease and the emotional turbulence it had brought into my life. I could see for the first time a path forward in which survival, engagement, and recognition were not mutually exclusive, but mutually reinforcing. By the end of the month, the household had shifted from a place of avoidance and denial to one of cautious support and accountability. The journey had not erased fear, pain, or discomfort, but it had transformed the emotional landscape. I realized that the battles I had fought against denial, against avoidance, and against the mounting opposition that I loved were as vital as the battles being fought in infusion rooms and imaging centers. The resolution, the new equilibrium, was not a return to old normalcy, but the creation of a new standard in which truth, advocacy, and engagement governed our interactions. That night, as I journaled once more, I reflected on the arc of the journey. The confrontation, the undeniable proof, and the insistence on accountability had created a ripple effect, transforming isolation into connection, doubt into validation, and resistance into engagement. I understood that my courage had not only preserved my life, but had also reshaped the emotional reality around me. The justice I experienced was not dramatic or public, it was quiet, deliberate, and profound. It was the affirmation that speaking truth, demanding acknowledgement, and insisting on responsibility could overcome the inertia of denial and inaction. And in that affirmation, I found peace, empowerment, and hope for the battles yet to come.
It was a crisp autumn morning when I finally felt the weight of the journey I had endured begin to shift into something lighter, something resilient. The months of treatment, confrontation, and advocacy had transformed not just my health, but my perspective, my confidence, and my sense of purpose. The scans that once haunted me now told a story of progress, a narrative not of denial, ignorance, or avoidance, but of survival, action, and empowerment. As I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight filtering through the blinds and falling across the charts I had meticulously organized, I felt a profound sense of peace settle into my bones. The battle had been long, exhausting, and emotionally turbulent, but the transformation was complete. I was no longer just a patient navigating illness. I was an advocate, a voice, and a living testament to the power of truth and persistence. Doug and Karen, who had once been so resistant, were quietly supportive now, no longer standing on the sidelines of my health, but participating, however imperfectly, in the daily rituals that sustained life and wellness. Doug had started asking thoughtful questions about medication schedules, treatment side effects, and progress timelines, no longer brushing off details or assuming ignorance was acceptable. Karen, who had once recoiled from the medical realities, now accompanied me to appointments, her presence steady, her actions deliberate. Even small gestures, a prepared meal, a hand on my shoulder, a willingness to listen, felt monumental after months of emotional distance. These actions were no longer perfunctory. They were part of a new pattern, a recalibration of connection grounded in acknowledgement, responsibility, and care. Ethan remained by my side, the unwavering anchor who had guided me through confrontation, validation, and the grueling cycles of treatment. His support had evolved alongside my own growth. Once a safety net, now a partnership, a reminder that courage is amplified by those willing to bear witness to truth and take action alongside you. Together, we reviewed scans, discussed progress, and planned next steps, not in fear or panic, but with clarity and hope. It was a shift that felt almost miraculous, not because the cancer had fully retreated, but because the emotional terrain had been transformed into a space where survival, clarity, and acknowledgement could coexist. I had also begun to extend my experience outward, sharing my story with friends, colleagues, and even strangers who faced similar battles. I realized that the journey from denial to advocacy, from avoidance to acknowledgement, was not just personal, it was instructive. I could help others navigate the isolation, the disbelief, and the emotional resistance that so often accompanies a serious diagnosis. Speaking at a small support group one afternoon, I recounted the months of struggle, confrontation, and evidence-backed advocacy, and I watched as eyes filled with understanding, gratitude, and recognition. The power of truth, I had learned, was not just in surviving it personally, but in using it to illuminate paths for others who might be trapped in the shadows of denial and fear. At home, the routines had changed dramatically. Family meals, once punctuated by avoidance and silence, became spaces of cautious connection. Conversations about appointments, medications, and side effects were now integrated into the daily rhythm, no longer taboo or deferred. The emotional terrain, once dominated by tension and withdrawal, had been replaced with a sense of cautious empowerment. Everyone knew the stakes, everyone recognized their role, and the foundation for practical, sustained support had been laid. The transformation was subtle but profound, an ongoing living demonstration of how courage and truth reshape relationships and priorities. One morning, as I walked through the garden behind the house, the sunlight catching the dew on the grass and the wind carrying the scent of autumn leaves, I paused to reflect. The journey from diagnosis to advocacy, from confrontation to vindication, had fundamentally altered who I was. I was no longer a passive participant in my own life. I was an active agent, wielding truth and evidence as tools for survival, agency, and empowerment. The transformation extended beyond the medical realm. It had infiltrated my sense of self, my relationships, and my vision for the future. I realized that the ordeal had gifted me clarity, courage, and a purpose that I would carry forward long after the immediate battles were won.
In the quiet of that morning, I resolved to honor this journey by living fully, by advocating relentlessly for those whose voices might otherwise be ignored, and by using my experience to illuminate the path from denial to empowerment. I began volunteering at a local cancer support center, sharing insights, offering guidance, and helping others navigate the complex interplay of medical reality, family dynamics, and personal agency. Each story I encountered, each hesitant voice I guided toward acknowledgement, reinforced the lessons I had learned. That undeniable proof, combined with courage, persistence, and advocacy, can transform fear into action, isolation into connection, and helplessness into empowerment. As the sun rose higher, casting golden light across the garden, I realized the journey had not only saved my life, it had reshaped it. The fear, the confrontation, the emotional turbulence had been arduous, but they had forged a resilience and purpose I had never imagined. The transformation was complete, from a young woman trapped in denial and isolation to a survivor empowered by truth, supported by allies, and committed to guiding others through the shadows. My story, once private and fraught with fear, had become a testament to the power of truth, courage, and advocacy. The ultimate reminder that even in the darkest moments, action, clarity, and persistence can create hope, validation, and transformation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.